Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation here in DC. And a little bit unusual event for us today because we want to have a group of folks who are really thoughtful and active in IT policy or tech policy in Washington, DC. And as you know from reading the description of the event, President Biden had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, where he laid out a legislative agenda for Congress in three main areas: privacy, content moderation, and antitrust, and really argued that there's massive problems here and that Congress needs to take action. And so we have a great event this morning to talk about that. Is the president right? Is any action needed? If so, what kind of action? I'm going to introduce the speakers very briefly, and then I'll make a few remarks, and then we'll go on to each speaker. We'll have about 7-8 minutes to talk, and we should have plenty of time for questions from the audience. First speaker is going to be Steve Del Bianco. Steve is the executive director of NetChoice, which is an organization that focuses on internet policy, particularly around smaller companies. Jules Polonetsky is the executive director and co-chair of the Future of Privacy Forum. Jules' expertise obviously is more on the privacy side of this, so we're looking forward to your comments there. Adam Kovakovich is the founder and CEO of the Chamber of Progress, which is a relatively new organization doing lots of interesting work about technology policy and why it's important to get it right for the future of the country. Linda Moore is president and CEO of TechNet, which is a technology company membership organization, a lot of Silicon Valley companies, and really focuses on a whole wide array of issues policy issues important for the technology economy. Jason Oxman is the president and CEO of the Information Technology and Industry Council. ITI goes way back in different names for almost 100 years, I guess, and leading trade association of technology companies in the world. And Jason is joining us from Brussels, so thank you. And finally, Gary Shapiro is the president and CEO of CTA, the Consumer Technology Association. Everybody knows CTA from the Vegas show, which was live this year and in person. But Gary also focuses on a broad array of technology policy questions for his members and to improve the country. So let me just say for audience members, you're encouraged to submit questions as we go through this, available on the Slido link. If you're watching it on the website, you can find the link in our event summary. If you're watching on YouTube or other social media, you can find the question link in the video description. So as I said, the president recently had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And if you read the op-ed carefully, in my opinion, there's a lot of overblown statements about how bad the problems are, and a lot of the regulatory solutions that he proposes or has proposed in the past to address these problems would actually, in our view, do more harm than good. That's not to say that we shouldn't have reform. We need a national privacy bill. ITI has been arguing that for a long time, but it needs to be the right kind of privacy bill. We've also argued, as my team, Daniel Castro and Ashley Johnson, have done a lot of work on how to improve Section 230. But it's not to get rid of Section 230. It's to improve it in ways that make it operate even better than it does. And finally, in terms of competition policy, I think there's a lot of good evidence that these markets are fairly competitive. They basically are in markets that are open to creative destruction. Who would have thought 5 years ago that Facebook would have been facing a competitor like TikTok? So just really quickly, I think the president's rhetoric in the op-ed really suffers from two major flaws. One is, why single out a few big companies? If privacy is an issue, which it is, it's an issue of big companies, small companies, medium-sized companies. It's an issue of online and offline. Why is online privacy any more important than offline privacy? In terms of content, again, why focus on big companies with online content? There's lots of places on the internet that have inappropriate content for children. There's lots of TV shows that have inappropriate content for children. So again, this narrow focus on one small segment of the economy for appropriate is just not the right way to think about it. Again, there are competition issues in a range of industries, particularly around conduct. Our view is that that's the most important thing in antitrust, not structure, not how big companies are, but the things they actually do. And secondly, and lastly, the president paints a pretty dystopian picture. You read this, you're thinking, God, I'd rather be living in the 1960s when everything was good. Then I didn't have to, I'd have to go to the Encyclopedia Britannica to find out what the GDP of Liberia was. And that was a good thing. It just seems to ignore the massive, massive benefits that all of us are getting from the data economy, from the IT economy, from the online economy. The president implied that targeted advertising is an inherent privacy violation. It is not. Targeted advertising is almost always done in an anonymous way where the advertiser doesn't know my name. They just know that I ride my bicycle to work, and so send me a bicycle ad. And also targeted advertising, as we're now learning in Europe, because they're making it harder to do that, is a key element of keeping the internet free. And the president's talking about a working class, middle class opportunity agenda. Imagine an internet where you got to pay for your monthly Google subscription, or you got to pay to use Facebook. For most of us on the call, it's like probably not a big deal at all. But if you're an average earner, if you're working a minimum wage job, that's a big deal. So we want to preserve the free and open internet. President talks about the online platforms as if they talk about child sexual exploitation, non-consensual pornography, and sale of dangerous drugs. I don't know what internet sites he's looking at, because again, the major companies do not do this. They work rigorously, religiously to keep that stuff off of their sites. There may be some bad sites out there, but the point there is you go after bad sites specifically, not a broad national law. Finally, the president says that big tech companies have elbowed mom and pop companies out of their platforms. I wonder if the president uses Amazon much, because when I go to Amazon, I almost always am buying from the Amazon store with hundreds of thousands of independent resellers on there who are using Amazon as a way to get to me. I would never see these businesses. They would never see me. And nobody's forcing consumers to shop there. Nobody's forcing these companies to go there. They're doing it because there's value. In fact, companies like Google and all the big companies have created enormous market opportunities for small companies to prosper. And again, signaling out that. So the last comment would be, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have congressional action or legislative, other kind of regulatory action, but it needs to be the right kind. It needs to be targeted and focused on the specific problem, not this broad, generalized kind of, almost hyperbole of how bad everything is. So with that overview, I want to turn it over to Steve. And Steve, would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Hey, Rob, you and ITIF have always been a voice of reason, perspective, and optimism on tech policy. I am so grateful for all that you do. The Wall Street Journal op-ed that we are talking about today was only the second domestic policy op-ed that President Biden has done since he's assumed office. So Biden's op-eds are rare, and this one was late, since the big Democratic antitrust bills all died in December, 4 weeks before he actually ran the op-ed. So this isn't about Biden having a newly discovered love for progressive antitrust laws and policies. Biden placed his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, not in the New York Times or the Washington Post. So the president is deliberately appealing to conservatives and the business audience that reads the Journal. I think the timing and placement are very intentional. And my message to the conservatives and business leaders is the same thing Admiral Akbar told the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars. It's a trap. And it's a trap in three parts. The notion that Biden wants limits on companies can collect, use, and share personal data. The second was for Congress to fundamentally reform Section 230. And the third was to get more competition back into the tech sector. Let me take those in turn. I think Biden is on the right track about privacy legislation. This is Data Privacy Week, and we want Congress to enact a national standard to replace an impossible patchwork of state laws, including some that award statutory damages in private lawsuits, like the disastrous Illinois Biometric Information Protection Act. So if the president is serious about data privacy, he should support the preemption of state laws and the preemption of private right of action with statutory damages. If he doesn't, then this legislative push by Biden is really just a trap for business and trap for Republicans, because it will not end up with a privacy law that will actually solve any of the problems. Number two, on Section 230, quote unquote, reform. Biden believes that he's discovered a common cause with conservatives and businesses who are upset about content moderation on social media. But wait, Democrats and Republicans have exactly the opposite aims in what they want to do to reform Section 230. Remember Biden's proposed disinformation governance board 2 years ago? Leaked documents from DHS were all about suppressing speech and debate over things like COVID lockdowns, vaccines, election integrity, and climate change. After the public blowback for this disinformation board, DHS shelved the project, but it essentially just went underground and continued, as we've seen in the Twitter files. The Twitter files show that when government gains leverage over social media sites, it uses that power to infringe on American freedoms that don't follow their political agenda. The Twitter files have rallied House Republicans to begin investigations into how the government coerces social media to censor Americans. That's long overdue. So I don't think the trap on Section 230 is going to work in Congress. Section 230 is what allows conservatives to dominate social media for sharing news and views that never see the light of day on mainstream media. And the third one up is competition and antitrust. Biden appeals to Congress to give his administration unprecedented new power to block acquisitions and regulate business practices, even where there's no showing of consumer harm. We've all heard Wu, Khan, and Cantor talk about their vision for antitrust enforcement. In writings that they did before they entered the administration, they talked about it as a tool to advance economic and political progressive causes. But at the same time, the trap is laid. Biden calls on Congress, knowing full well that Congress is not likely to have consensus over the next 2 years. So he's really not going to wait for Congress at all. Yesterday, his Department of Justice sued Google for prior acquisitions and the way Google manages their online ad platform. This is effectively the same as the Texas Attorney General lawsuit that was dismissed by a federal court in September. And then Senator Mike Lee tweeted yesterday or after the announcement that an antitrust lawsuit is good, but will take a long time and it applies to only one company. Lee went on to say that we need to make sure the competition works for everyone, and soon. He'll be reintroducing the Competition and Transparency in Digital Advertising Act. So President Biden asks Wall Street Journal readers to help him gain more power over America's tech businesses. But I think congressional conservatives generally don't support giving more power to the administrative sedate. In fact, the federal government needs more accountability, not more unaccountable power, to transform America's economy to suit progressive priorities. And I'll close just by saying that conservative and congressional Republicans, they do see the trap being laid, and they'll use their control of the House to investigate federal agencies that pressure social media to remove what the administration thinks is disinformation that's unfavorable to the administration's agenda. I look forward to the other panelists' remarks and to your questions.
Steve, that was great. Thank you. I love the Star Wars analogy. Great part of that. I don't know what the the big dark star is here or whatever, but you can talk about that later. So, Jules, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for including me. It is indeed Data Protection Week, but the reason this is Data Protection Week amongst all others is that it marks the anniversary of Convention 108, a global agreement that many countries have signed on to around privacy. And so let me start with data protection, but with a thank you to the administration for making international data flows and the EU-US data relationship a major priority. Lots of work over the last couple of years, and although we'll yet see whether it meets the European Court muster, the changes and the oversight that the P Club and DOJ and the other agencies are putting in place to try to support that global consensus, as well as the administration's strong support for the OECD process, which recently gave us the beginnings of a global consensus of surveillance versus privacy. So kudos there. Although I'm going to focus on data protection, let me remind you of a recent article by Professor Nadeja Partova at Tilburg University, who wrote about how data protection law is becoming the law of everything. And although I won't talk a lot about 230 or competition, the reason I think data protection has to come first or come along, because you can't really, frankly, address those without having an understanding of what baseline privacy law looks like. I mean, consider competition. If privacy and the strictest privacy standard and not sharing or not engaging with apps or interoperability or identity, all sorts of things that we know are necessary for competition, if privacy is the answer because the maximum protection is what we want and need, well, that puts an end to the competition debate. We need an understanding of the balance and the conflicts which do exist between competition and privacy. And so hard to do that without understanding what the legal norm is. And then we can debate, is some company going too far or others too short? What's the appropriate balance? And similarly, 230. I mean, it's clear that any significant change to 230 means companies doing an awful lot of surveillance to track things that are said and posted and done. And we see the downsides of that around the world. I fear many of the proposals that are advanced to deal with the kinds of concerns push us into a surveillance structure that creates, frankly, real serious privacy concerns. So data protection's got to be at the table, if not first, alongside. Otherwise, we're going to learn that privacy law is built because of competition and because of surveillance, and that will be the default. We're seeing that already happening with youth issues. Out of real valid concerns, and the administration has focused and highlighted those, we're seeing proposals that are quite strong in ensuring that companies know the age and often, as a result, identity of just about anybody who's accessing their sites, lest they run into concerns of not appropriately putting child-directed content or child-directed settings. There is a real conflict, and the answer isn't to sort of avoid it, but the answer isn't to simplify it and say, let's just protect kids. We need to recognize that teens and kids and young adults are at sports sites or at gaming sites, are mixed among us, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be necessary, but it does create some real conflicts. And I think sometimes engaging this with simply, let's protect the children, opens up the door to critics who maybe don't want children easily accessing LGBTQ material or have other agendas. Okay, so let's jump in. We do need a national privacy law. It's incredible that the US is one of the very few democracies in the entire world that does not have a comprehensive privacy law. Kudos to the administration for making civil rights in the NTIA process, in their AI advocacy, a center part of data protection law. That's perhaps the most important part of the current, or at least last session's bipartisan effort. But it's time for the administration, I think, to move from rhetoric and op-ed to engaging in a process that moves along this issue. But be aware, we're regulating the majority of the US economy when we do so. It took 7 years to get GDPR done. There are hard and complicated issues and trade-offs. And I think treating it as sort of a battle between this constituency and that misses the fact that there are human rights issues that we do need to balance and get right. We want data available for research, right? We want data available for commerce. We want to make sure data isn't overly available to be subject to perhaps, access by prosecutors for purposes that might be unwanted, Dobbs related and so forth. And so it's time, I think, for the administration to move to the legislative table and bring some of the sober thinking that is needed that can help support Congress in its effort to ensure that data needed, for instance, to identify discrimination, if we're going to focus on civil rights, which I think is the key area. That's where the most significant harms are. That's where I think there's the broadest consensus in addressing the real ways that data can be used to limit opportunity, to limit employment, to limit housing, and frankly, more energy to those agencies at EOC and at HUD. We've seen, limited cases, but data-driven discrimination exists, and the agencies that are center in terms of advancing and protecting those civil rights need to be, frankly, lead at the table. This can't all be solved by the FTC. And frankly, although the FTC has room to advance its rulemaking, perhaps enshrining much of the case law that it has set out. Much of what the FTC wants to do is high stakes and hard to see how the dramatic changes, or even frankly, some of the necessary changes, can be done with solely a rulemaking. So really critical that the administration engage in a sober and potent way, recognizing the need of data for research, recognizing the need of data for competition, but getting to the legislative table. I'll conclude with that. Thanks for the chance.
Jules, thank you. And it was a good, I appreciate you laying out some positive or proactive things that the administration can do. And maybe we can get to that when we wrap up a little later. So thank you. So over to you, Adam.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rob, first of all, and ITIF for hosting us. I want to start out by saying that I'm a proud Democrat. I think Joe Biden's doing a great job. I want to see him reelected, assuming he runs again. And I think that his 2020 victory was powered by an urban-suburban coalition of voters that I believe is very happy with tech services. And so my biggest concern as someone who supports President Biden is that the Biden tech agenda may not fully reflect the priorities of the Biden voter. So I thought I'd inject a little public opinion data into this conversation and ask Lauren to pull up a few slides. First, President Biden's op-ed said a lot about voters' concerns about tech, but almost nothing about the voters valuing tech, and this is a point that's been made by other panelists. And I think the Beltway bubble has kind of assumed for years that there is a broad voter backlash against tech. But the data shows that there really is no techlash among Democratic voters. For the past 3 years, Pew Research Center has asked voters whether they felt that technology companies have a, quote, positive effect on the way things are going in the country these days, unquote. And what's notable about these results is that while the Republican voter sentiment towards tech has dropped 18 points in 3 years, and I think that's largely due to Trump and Fox and that effect, Democratic voter sentiment towards tech has remained both consistent and consistently positive. It's at 58%. And if you go to the next slide, Pew actually breaks this down, voters between conservative, moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats, and liberals. You'll see that while conservatives have the most negative sentiment towards the tech industry, self-described moderate Democratic voters, these are the swing voters who put Joe Biden over the top in those key suburbs in 2020. They comprise about half of the Democratic electorate. They have the most positive feelings towards tech of all voters. That's the light blue line, 64% positive towards tech. So I hope that the Biden administration will see that there really is no such thing as a Democratic techlash. Democrats remain consistently positive towards tech. Second, if you go to the next slide, with that as background, we wanted to know how people who voted in last year's midterm elections wanted the Biden administration to approach tech policy and regulation. So our organization commissioned Morning Consult to do a survey in mid-November, just after the elections of just midterm voters. If you go to the next slide, the first question we asked was, when it comes to the Biden administration's approach to tech issues, which view came closest to their opinion? So first, would you like to see the Biden administration take aggressive action against the tech industry? Only 10% agreed with that. On the other extreme, only 14% of voters said the Biden administration should leave tech completely alone, sort of libertarian position. But it's in the middle where things really got interesting. So 40% of voters said that they wanted to see more tech consumer protection regulations, but they want to make sure that that regulation doesn't make apps and services less useful. And 23% of voters said the top tech priority should be more tech jobs, not more tech regulation. And of course, we've seen the tech industry has shed 200,000 jobs since the beginning of last year. What you're seeing here, this is significant. Nearly a quarter of midterm voters are saying to the administration their top priority should be creating more tech jobs in more places. If you go to the next slide, we wanted to drill down into specific issues, because it's not enough to say that voters want action on tech regulation. You really have to ask which specific issues are at the top of their wish list. So when we asked voters which tech issues, these are midterm voters, which issues they'd like to see the Biden administration focus on, their top ranked priorities were fighting scams and malware, enacting consumer privacy regulation, which Steve and Jules and Rob have all talked about, combating data discrimination, it's really important, and bringing more broadband. At the bottom of their priority list were three issues that were mentioned in the president's op-ed: eliminating Section 230 liability protection, banning targeted advertising, and banning vertically integrated services like Amazon Prime and Google Maps. So there may be a slight disconnect with voters here in terms of where to focus. If you go to my last slide, President Biden's op-ed appealed to Congress. And so we asked voters, midterm voters, which tech issues they wanted to see Congress most focus on. And this slide shows those results broken down by voter party ID, because I think that's significant here. And I just want to highlight three big takeaways from this. First, there is bipartisan voter agreement around online security and privacy being high priorities. Those rank the highest, right? Second, there is bipartisan agreement that antitrust legislation, which was here, we asked about App Store legislation and vertical integration bans, those are a low priority for voters. The voters do say that they oppose business consolidation that raises prices for consumers, which I think we see in other sectors. And finally, and Steve talked about this, there's significant party line disagreement over online speech and content moderation. Democrats say here they want more action against misinformation. The inverse of that, Republicans say they want more protection of free speech online. And that is why I think it's superficial to call Section 230 content moderation issue ripe for bipartisan agreement, because what Steve said, the parties want is two fundamentally different things. It's like saying there's a bipartisan consensus for taking a trip. Sure, but if one party wants to go to New York and the other wants to go to New Mexico, that's not really a consensus. And what you saw time and time again last year was that the Republicans want to neuter platforms' ability to engage in content moderation. They turned almost every tech bill last year into an anti-content moderation bill. And so neutering content moderation really isn't a right bipartisan issue. It's an area where Democrats, I think, should resist Republicans tooth and nail. So to close, Joe Biden's success as a politician, I think, has really been premised on his instinct for the average voter. This data shows that the Biden voters are not radicals when it comes to tech. They're pragmatists. They want to see a Biden tech policy agenda that's less ivory tower and more Scranton. So, let's give voters more security and privacy protections. Let's bring broadband and tech jobs to more parts of the country. Let's preserve platforms' ability to keep their communities healthy and moderate content. And let's not mess with the value that tech apps and services are giving millions of people every day. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. It was really interesting polling. One of the points you made, or the poll made, was Americans want more tech jobs and they want them in more places. And ITIF was instrumental in getting a component of the CHIPS and Science Act. But I think one of the things the administration is doing really well now with is they're implementing that program in the process of implementing that so that we can get more tech jobs to the Scrantons of the world, or the Columbus, Ohios of the world, or the Oklahoma cities of the world. So that to me is a great agenda, and I'm glad the administration is moving forward on it. So Linda, over to you.
Well, thanks for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the work you do and your team does at ITIF to really educate the public and the media and policymakers on these incredibly complicated issues. I'll dive right into the president's op-ed, which is sort of our jumping off point for the conversation today. I think that his intent is certainly good. I think that he has hit upon some concerns that a lot of the public has. I think that all of us just want to talk about, getting those policies right. I do want to applaud the president for all the work he's done to lay the foundation for long-term success in America. At a time when I think a lot of voters doubted the ability of government to do anything beyond very short-term and small bore bills, getting the infrastructure bill done and getting the CHIPS and Science Act done. I think that the president deserves a ton of credit for that. And I'm really excited to be a part of making sure that those bills are implemented properly and protected as they move forward, because there will be new members of Congress and possibly even new players in an administration, years down the road that will play a significant role in whether those programs are successful or not. And I'll come back to that at the end of my comments. But let's dive into, I guess, the premise of the op-ed. At the very top was President Biden said, the U.S. is the most innovative country in the world. Well, is it? When the Bloomberg Index debuted in 2013, the U.S. was number 1. In the latest Bloomberg Innovation Index, we dropped to number 11. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But a part of it is our immigration laws that prohibit enough of the highly talented, highly skilled people that we need to do all the things that we need to do to be the most innovative country in the world. That's one thing. And also the fact that we don't produce enough homegrown, high-skilled talent to really make us on the cutting edge of all these emerging technologies that we have at our fingertips that we need to compete with China on, so that American values are instilled in the use of all these incredibly new, exciting technologies like quantum computing and AI. I'll pivot from that all the way to privacy. I think all of us have talked about how much we want a privacy bill done, and the consumers want that too. We've got over 80% of Republicans and Democrats agree that this should be a top priority for Congress. Now at TechNet, we do 50 state advocacy in addition to working with the Congress. And there have been over 130 bills, privacy bills, introduced in 43 states since 2018. And we have been engaged on all of those. We need to really look at the two things that are the most divisive in privacy legislation. One is private right of action. The idea of private right of action there is to make sure we protect those small and medium-sized companies from frivolous lawsuits that will drive them out of business. And then a very, very key part of it is preemption. If a federal bill does not preempt state laws, you're just adding to the problem. You're not solving it. You're making the federal law the 51st privacy regime to adhere to. Even when the Europeans did the GDPR, the privacy regulation for the European continent, they knew that preemption was absolutely critical. When the California legislators put together the privacy bill in California, the very first state privacy law here in the US, San Francisco and other cities started to develop their own privacy laws. And California legislators, rightly so, immediately made sure that their bill preempted all state and local laws. Preemption is hugely important because, as we know, the large companies of any size, because it's not just tech companies who have control of data to deliver customer services and the experience that customers want, they know that the large companies can hire legions of attorneys to deal with as many privacy regimes that are thrown at them. It's the small and medium-sized companies that do not have the resources to hire compliance attorneys to deal with 51 different privacy regimes. And we want them spending their resources on hiring employees and on their products. Now we move on to antitrust. That is something that, honestly, even the co-sponsors of the antitrust bills that were seen in this past Congress could agree on. You had Republican co-sponsors of the bill saying that the bill did one thing, and then Democratic co-sponsors of the bill saying it did another. One thing I think we can all agree on is customers don't want the services that they rely on every single day and that they love to be degraded. Small businesses, medium-sized businesses want those platforms to reach their customers. And so getting this antitrust measure right is incredibly important. And again, I agree with you, Rob. We do see a need for regulation in these areas, but getting them right so that we protect the small and medium-sized businesses is the most important thing. I think a lot of policymakers, take for granted that America is the most innovative country in the world. Is that really true? And will it remain true? And B, are we really looking out for those up and coming businesses, or are the unintended consequences of the antitrust bill going to really stifle and put those businesses out of the marketplace? I want to also just point out that I think one thing that's very troubling is the antitrust bills focus on making sure that these laws apply to, and they do apply to, because some of it is just the control that the U.S. government has, apply to only U.S. companies. They don't touch our foreign rivals. We have foreign rivals, companies and nations who have very large consumer bases in the U.S., and for the U.S. government to pass laws that are going to hamstring U.S. companies and that advantage our foreign rivals, I don't think is exactly what anyone thinks that the U.S. government is supposed to be doing. There's been a lot of talk here already about Section 230. I will just say that my biggest concern is that Section 230 is preserved, because I think that if it's not, you will drive discourse completely offline. People will be so worried, especially up and coming platforms will be so worried about exposing themselves to lawsuits, frivolous or otherwise, that they will just make sure that there's no online content at all that people can engage in to express their views. And that can really stifle the views of especially minority consumers and also just people who have a different idea about politics. I want to just focus on, what the Congress and the Biden administration could be doing that would be really helpful to the country. And we talked about this just a little bit as you were leading into my segment. The Chips and Science Act, hugely important piece of legislation. One thing that wasn't done in that is to fund the tech hubs. We just talked about the importance of spreading innovation and opportunity all across the country, but that part of the bill wasn't funded. And the number one priority for TechNet this year is going to make sure that those tech hubs are funded so that we can get the rest of the country involved in the innovation game, and so that they have a stake in the process, and they have all of the job opportunities, training opportunities, skills opportunities that come with that. But a critical part of it as well is making sure that we have the talent to really make the CHIPS Act all that it's supposed to be. It's estimated that we need at least 50,000 semiconductor engineers just to staff the investments that semiconductor companies have already announced in the US. And so making sure that we have the talent that we need to do the fabs that we're talking about for the semiconductors, but also electric vehicle transition and clean energy transition. That part's hugely important. Thanks, Rob.
Linda, thank you. I think you brought up a really important point that if you think you're number one, there used to be that famous car commercial, we're Avis, we're number two, we try harder. If you're number one, you don't have to try, and you can say, well, we can afford these rules and regulations that might impinge or restrict our innovation system because, hey, after all, we're number one. And to your point, we're not number one. You look at many, many different metrics. We just released a report yesterday looking at overall inputs and outputs and outcomes for China, things like engineers, patents, R&D, and they're ahead of us. I'm not saying they're more innovative than us, but they're ahead of us on these things. So we can't just assume that our great success in the past is going to translate over into the future unless we're very careful and deliberative about it. So thank you, Linda. Jason, over to you from Brussels. I hope the transatlantic cables are working well. So they look like they are.
They are indeed. And Rob, let me take advantage of being in Brussels to first thank you for the opportunity to be here with my esteemed colleagues, and thanks for all the work that the Foundation does on these critical tech policy issues. I'll actually take the international perspective because I'm here this week largely focused on the all-important transatlantic relationship between the EU and the US. And for the Biden administration's tech agenda, taking an international approach is vitally important to all of the policy goals that we've been talking about. Obviously, Europe has been the lead on privacy legislation. We can't get it done in the US for some reason. Europe got it done many years ago with GDPR. But it's also really important that we position the United States effectively on issues related to economic and national security with our partners in Europe. And I think if we're to urge the Biden administration's tech agenda to focus on things that actually matter to the American people, it's keeping America competitive in the global marketplace and remembering that American business thrives when it is able to access the 95% of the consumers on planet Earth who don't live in the United States. And so this week here in Brussels, it's actually been incredibly frustrating to hear so many questions from European Commission officials and members of the European Parliament about whether the U.S. still values the U.S. EU relationship. You know, there was a little bit of headline dispute arising out of the infrastructure law that has been talked about. The IRA, obviously, in its language, appeared to exclude access of European companies to opportunities for infrastructure investment in the U.S. I think we now know pretty clearly that that was not the intent, that some in Congress didn't recognize that the EU and the U.S. didn't actually have a free trade agreement, and therefore we're not eligible for the same provisions that Canada and Mexico are. But that aside, I think it is an example of how, for a tech agenda to be successful, making sure that the European partners and like-minded democracies, those countries that share our values, are on the same page. And we've seen a difference in approach between the EU and the US on regulatory issues. The Digital Markets Act, for example, is something that the EU moved forward on that wasn't necessarily universally embraced outside of the EU. But now that that's in the implementation phase, I think it highlights what a challenging path it was for the EU to choose to base its regulatory regime on the market capitalization and revenue turnover of companies, because the companies that they initially thought would be included within the purview of the DMA don't have the same large revenue and large market cap that they did when the legislation was first initiated. So it's more important to focus on behavior as opposed to the size of companies. And that's the message we would deliver to the Biden administration as well. Picking a few companies because of their size to target is not the right path. We want to target behaviors. We want to target consumer protection, and harm to consumers can come from businesses regardless of size. So it's not appropriate to pick particular companies just because they happen to have a large market cap or they happen to have a lot of revenue. We've also seen a move here in Europe to increase the regulatory regime that applies to emerging technologies. The AI Act is moving forward here in Europe at a rapid clip. And there's a very real risk that Europe will adopt different definitions of AI than are adopted in the United States, which means technologies that don't necessarily respect or recognize boundaries and we want to be available internationally would be hindered in their deployment outside of the US. So what should the Biden administration be doing? Taking advantage of the established Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the US, which was launched to much fanfare 2 years ago. ITI was an early proponent of it and supported its work, but it has gotten away from its original mission, which was to bring the EU and the US together for a unified approach that promotes innovation as opposed to pursuing a small number of companies. And that's something we need to get back to. We need a unified definition of AI. We need the Trade and Technology Council to focus on some proposals in Europe here that would exclude US cloud providers from offering service here. That's not a good move either. And we can unify approaches and unify definitions to make sure that's not the case. We also have seen a lot of discussion of the need for trade agreements. Why don't the US and the EU have trade agreements? Why isn't the Biden administration focusing more on entering into market access provisions with our like-minded allies around the world? The best way to counter China, as Rob and the foundation have written extensively about, is to partner with like-minded countries around the world, trade more with them, and move economic activity to those countries that share our values and are like-minded democracies instead of excluding them. And the Biden administration's tech agenda should include a focus on trade as well. The same thing could be said about the national security implications of export controls and other measures that the Biden administration is working on. We need to be partnered with Europe and other like-minded allies, ensuring that there is a global approach so that companies that are headquartered in one allied country aren't advantaged or disadvantaged vis-a-vis access to markets around the world. They certainly don't represent national security threats to the United States, and they shouldn't be treated as such. So that's very important to us as well. The presence here in Brussels of ITI is because ITI is an international organization. About 25% of our members are headquartered outside of the US. And I think it is important for us to take that global approach to the technology policy issues that were raised in the president's op-ed. The privacy law has been extensively discussed. We support a federal privacy law in the United States, and we hope that moves forward. And on other issues related to content, we just filed a brief in the Supreme Court on the Section 230 litigation, Gonzalez Google case. And we're very concerned that there is not a recognition that algorithms are a vitally important technology, and Section 230 needs to protect algorithms. And we need to make that technology available widely. And there's a very real risk that the Supreme Court will limit its availability. So all that to say that we think that technology policy always needs to take a global lens. Obviously, it's vitally important for the Biden administration to focus on American security and focus on growing American businesses. But the success of American business and the national security of the United States is much better secured when we work closely with our partners here in Europe and around the world to move a shared agenda forward. So, Rob, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, the old question of how do we work with our allies? How do we make sure that our regulatory approaches are consistent with making the global internet still work? Critical questions, including, as you noted, data flows as well. So thank you. Over to Gary. Gary, you have the pleasure of the responsibility of wrapping up the formal remarks. So looking forward to it.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks to the foundation. And it's great to have such smart colleagues. Some people may think we're competitors, but actually looking at this, these very brilliant people with great ideas, and I'm glad they're all there. Competition in trade associations is actually a healthy, good thing, and we're cooperative. And I think that's a great example for industry as well. We favor competition. So the Consumer Technology Association is an American organization, American companies, 1,500 tech companies. 80% of them are small business. And you would think, based on what we've heard, that they'd support some of these things that are being advocated. It would protect them. They don't want it. They want to make sure that they can continue to invest, to partner with bigger companies, to sell to them, to be bought out by them. Very important for the entire investment innovation ecosystem. The small companies are created, and they're united as an industry in saying some of these ideas are just not good. I've been writing about innovation for at least 20 years. I have 3 books on innovation, over 1,000 commentaries. My first book over a dozen years ago, I talked about the threat of China, how they're growing rapidly, and the US needs a strategy. And the strategy is based, it's a good one. I think most would agree upon. And it's based on, talent. It's based on education. It's based on investment. It's based on the free market system. Now, we own and produce a CES, and it was held a couple of weeks ago. And we had well over 100 policymakers there from Washington and around the world. And something President Macron has attended a number of times. He's based a lot of what he's seen in France on what he sees at CES and what we've done elsewhere. And he's focused his campaign on innovation. And certainly France figured it out. They went from 1 unicorn to some 25 unicorns now. But if you look at Europe, which is the model we're shifting towards, as France is shifting towards us, it's a different. I agree totally with the comments of Jason and others that we should be working with our allies in Europe. They're our friends. We should keep our friends really close. We should work cooperatively with them. And this big shift away from China to the U.S. and other places for manufacturing should embrace our friends in Europe. We seem to have a little hiccup now because legislation is treating them as if they're our enemies. We have this recent law that passed that's very protectionist. I think it's a bad precedent. But generally, we have to understand that what this is, the bigger battle is really not about us. It's about our children and grandchildren and what kind of world they're going to inherit. And that is based on what we believe in as Americans and what unites us, and what unites us with Western Europe and Canada and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand and certain South American countries and elsewhere, and Israel. And that is a fundamental view in human rights and in democracy. And it's really a threat today, more so than when I wrote my first book over a dozen years ago. China is obviously in ascendance. They're growing, they're fast. Obviously, they blew their COVID policy. There's some hiccups that they have. They decided they would attack their own tech companies, as we're doing now. That they clearly have reversed from. They think that's a mistake. They have a strategy. They have the ability to do things with artificial intelligence, and that aren't bound by the conventional concepts that we have in the United States about privacy. It's like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. On the one hand, China has no concerns about privacy, and they arrange huge data sets, which artificial intelligence could take advantage of. Speaking to healthcare professionals and researchers, they're jealous of what they could do in terms of figuring out with millions of people what works and what doesn't. And that applies to many different things beyond healthcare. Europe certainly went first on privacy, and they had a pretty broad thing, which we're actually emulating, but we've been in the middle. We've taken an approach as a country which has worked, and it's gotten to this amazing point where we have a lot of the world's most dominant tech companies. And to see a headline about uniting against big tech, the President of the United States, it hurts me greatly because he's very well intentioned. And we know that there's certain things that have been done by the platforms, which in retrospect were mistakes. But generally, overall, as we go around the world and what I see and attaching and speaking, I was at an event in The Hague a few years ago, and the discussion was about regulating the internet. And it was a very European view. We have to stop this. We have to regulate AI immediately. And it was like, wow, they want to kill things before they're even born. And I was upset about it because of that. But then I was sitting at a table with people from 2 women, one from Africa and another from Latin America. He said, you guys have first world problems here. We love this free in search engines. We love the free Facebook at the time. This is so important to us. So there's a lot of benefits about it. There's a lot of things there, but we have to recognize this as a national strategy. We face some impediments now. We have a litigation tax that doesn't exist in other countries. We have lawyers that are inserting themselves into all sorts of legislation that could be really good, like a federal preemptive law. And they said, we want our piece. They're out there blocking even something that is as basic as self-driving cars, which will save human lives. And we're struggling now while China is surging forward, and we can't even get a national privacy law. So the bottom line is there are certain things. Big is not bad. Big is good. It has great jobs, great contributions, great stuff. And as Jason said, it's not the technology which should be regulated. It's the behavior of what people or even technologies do with it that is bad. We've never regulated technologies other than maybe radar detectors or nuclear bombs or cable theft boxes. But to start regulating technology and having government right rules will choke off innovation in ways we can't even predict. So we have to agree that we as a nation should be first and focused on technology. And we should be allowed and encouraging innovation. The whole CES is run with the concept that the smallest company could access retailers, investors, partners from around the world, because we have to allow easy access and entry into the marketplace. And that's in the interest of big companies and small companies. And these proposals out there to start reducing the ability to invest are just not good. And we also have to recognize that that every company, every business has a right to know what the law is. And to have these ideas that are coming out of nowhere where we're shifting away from what's best for consumers, the consumer welfare standard, to saying that we have to protect existing competitors, we have lost our way as a nation when we're attacking our own best countries and doing it to preserve competitors rather than saying what is best for consumers. So we have good intention, but we're going about it in a very bad way. And I'd be happy to talk about soon about some things that actually are positive that can make a difference.
Hey, Gary, thanks so much. You mentioned, you said big is not bad, big is good. I thought you were going to say big is beautiful, the name of my last book with Mike Lind that's available on Amazon for a discount these days. Just teasing. You did raise, I think, a number of really important points, but I thought one of them that I think bears repeating, and you didn't use this word specifically. The Europeans have long embraced what's called the precautionary principle. A new technology comes out. Oh, we don't know what it's good. We better regulate it. The US from the founding fathers have embraced the innovation principle. Hey, this is good. Let's go forward. And if there's some challenges, I mean, leaving aside, as you noted, nuclear power or things like that, leaving aside those, our general view is let's see how it works out. Let's see how the market, consumers, and other things have, sort of fix it. And then, and only then, should we be thinking about a regulatory step. And that's a very, very different framework. And one of the things I worry about is that we're adopting the European precautionary approach principle. So
Can I respond to that, Rob? Absolutely.
Sure, please do.
Companies should not have to go to the federal government to ask permission for innovation. We're moving quickly into a lot of new areas. And certainly it's the behavior we have to say, what could go wrong here? And let's regulate the behavior. Let's say what the law is. But to go to the government to ask permission will slow us down and reverse the course. And I think there's different ways of measuring innovation and dominance. Obviously, it's just not the number of patents, because we know that a lot of countries have spurious patents. But we have to say what our goal is here. And our goal is really to make sure that our kids inherit a better world. And if we keep that in mind, I think we'll do the right thing, because technology is the solution to a lot of the world's biggest problems. And if we handcuff just U.S. companies, we're really hurting ourselves and our kids, and also protecting our fundamental human rights potentially as China continues to grow. I mean, we believe in things, and we believe in them with a lot of other countries. And we should be working with those countries who should be agreeing that innovation matters, and innovation can solve everything from the right to clean air and clean water to healthcare, to the right to food, and to the right to all the things that we value as Americans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's bring everybody back in. And I want to ask some of the questions that have popped up here from the chat. And one of them I'm going to paraphrase a tad, but essentially the question is, we've talked about some of the things that we're concerned about with the president's approach. A number of you, Linda, Jules, Jason, talked about some proactive things that the administration is either doing or could or should do. Let's just spend a few minutes on that. What are some of the things you think the Biden administration should be focusing on, either on their own administrative action or in pushing and pressing Congress to take action? I don't know, Steve, do you want to go first?
Yeah, if any of you watched the Taylor Swift Ticketmaster hearing yesterday in Senate Judiciary Committee, you've got a plain example of what the Biden administration Justice Department need to do. We can't have good things, nice things, and it's because Ticketmaster has a genuine classic textbook 80% market share and frankly has been frustrating consumers in a way that harms consumer welfare. This is a slam dunk opportunity for the Biden administration to bring antitrust action or to enforce the consent decree that Ticketmaster agreed to when they acquired Live Nation. So the administration itself doesn't have to wait for a conflicted and divided Congress. It can take action immediately. And if anything argues for action, it's, well, taking care of Taylor Swift's fan base.
Okay. I've never been to a Taylor Swift concert. Never will. All right, good. So you have firsthand experience. Adam.
Yeah, well, I just want to add to something, and I think Linda talked about the CHIPS Act being one of the biggest successes of the Biden administration and Congress working together to make an investment. And I think I would add to that the investments in broadband as part of the the infrastructure bill that were passed. Gary talked a little bit about autonomous vehicles. Like, there's no reason we shouldn't be looking at emerging technology and apply the CHIPS Act model to things like autonomous vehicles and other emerging tech. And some of that may require saying, okay, we have to give permission. Like, we do have to bless this thing, but also that we really have an intent as Congress and administration to gain advantage over China. And some people call that industrial policy, but I think that we're moving, I think, towards what some people call an abundance agenda of really really investing in these spaces that we want to do better in. So I'd like to see more of that.
Jason.
Thanks, Rob. And I'll build on Adam, and happy birthday, Adam, by the way. Let me be the first to say that publicly in this venue. The CHIPS and Science Act was enormously important. Linda covered it in great detail. I'll just add that if there's not more funding to be had for the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act, we hope there will be. But one thing that Congress could move forward on expeditiously in the vein of incentives is on tax policy. Fixing some issues related to investment tax credits, fixing the way in which corporations are allowed to take credit for investments that are made in research and development, allowing them to realize that in the current year that those investments are made. Also encouraging more CHIPS development on the research and development side through investment tax credits, particularly important for non-fab-based companies. So all of those tax policy incentives, I think, are vital, and the Biden administration could play an important role in moving those forward.
And then, Rob, I would just add that the administration does have the ability to make some discrete changes in how they're approaching green cards and visas. That would make a difference in the ability to bring in foreign talent. All of us, believe in, educating the children, training the adults, making sure that we have the workforce, from our own country that we need. But that's a years-long process, and we are just not getting enough engagement in STEM, especially, post-secondary degree STEM education, masters and PhDs. We still have the #1 education system in the world. We have people from all over the world who come here to America to study because they want the best education in the world. And because our immigration system is broken, we send them back home to compete against us rather than keeping them here where they want to be to build their career. And so I know that, this has become a very, polarizing issue, especially in the Congress, which has huge, jurisdiction over this, much more than the very small, narrow part that the administration has. And it's all been focused on the southern border crisis. High-skilled immigration is not connected to the southern border crisis at all. And so I just really urge Republicans and Democrats to really look at, all that's before us in terms of fulfilling the promise of the CHIPS and Science Act that they supported, so that we can really make it all that it's supposed to be.
That's great.
Could I jump in here?
Yeah, Gary.
follow up on Linda's comments about immigration. I mean, if you look at what makes the U.S. successful in innovation, a large part of it is attributable to the fact that we are an immigrant nation. We're the most diverse nation in the world. If you look at the tech companies that are started or headed by immigrants or children of immigrants, it's phenomenal. In terms of the percentages are really high. Immigrants overproduce. And it's been our national strategy, unspoken about for years, but we need these immigrants. Although there's definitely some rebalancing going on in the tech industry with jobs. Certainly, a lot of companies were very aggressive in counting on a very high growth economy, but they're still also hiring for different skills as their people are leaving, and a lot of that, honestly, those skills are not present in the U.S. There's a lot of talk in Congress. There's almost bipartisan agreement that we want to move to the U.S. for more manufacturing. I understand why that's an important effort, and I agree with it. It's just a matter of timing and how it's done. But to have manufacturing in the U.S., we need skilled workers. We need apprenticeship programs. We need white-collar apprenticeship programs. We need the type of education that Linda's talking about. We also need an energy supply that is consistent. We need, honestly, to reduce the deficit. And that's because we don't take a position as an association, in contrast with some of the other people who have spoken, because one of the fundamental concerns we have is the health of the U.S. economy. And there is a limit that we are reaching soon of how we could keep our deficit spending. So we do not ask the government for money for any of our industry members. We stay out of those discussions. It's not that we don't oppose it. We don't support it. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. We don't support it. We don't oppose it. But because we're concerned about the debt. But I think the job of the government in this way is to protect consumers, bring back the consumer welfare standard. The FTC eliminated it with the chairman's stroke. And we should do things which encourage innovation by Americans. But we also have to recognize we have allies out there that also believe in democracy and have the same values we do. And we should be looking to them. And I raised before the litigation tax. We have to bring back legal certainty. Our exports should be lawyers. We don't need more lawyers, frankly. We need more people that are skilled in math and science.
Can we export them?
I'm willing. I offered on CNN a while
How about
back.
trade? We could do trades. We could do trades.
Trade lawyers for oil makes sense for me.
Hey, we'll take one PhD scientist. We'll give you 5 lawyers.
That's a good ratio. We should start a separate market for that.
Call it square. Hey, I want to segue over. There's a number of questions on privacy that Jules would be ideally positioned to. I did want to point out one point regarding Gary and Linda on high skill STEM. We were approached by the Smith Richardson Foundation a few years ago to do a study where we found basically the 1,000 most important innovators, inventors in the U.S., people who had filed and won triadic patents or had won the R&D Innovation Awards that R&D Magazine does. And we were able to survey 1,000 of them, 1,000 responses. 44% were first or second generation immigrants. So these are the most important innovations, the most important inventions, and 44% were first or second generation. And to your point, Gary, the number of the American population who is first or second generation immigrants is way, way below that. So they're sort of outperforming, if you will. Jules, some privacy questions. Let me just sort of summarize them here. One was a question around carve-outs for B2B transactions in the new privacy bill. I know you can see these questions. Something about civil rights and privacy, and can the president do something specifically on his own there? Something about, should health data be in a new bill? Should it be carved out of the proposed privacy bill? And finally, something about groups that represent marginalized communities support privacy legislation. Does that change the panel's analysis? Let me just mention on that one, I don't think it does, because I think every person on this panel supports a robust and effective national privacy bill that would include those issues. But Jules, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. The stakeholders I work with daily are generally the chief privacy officers, privacy advocates, privacy-focused academics. And so, although I can't speak for all of them, I'll try to share some insights and tick off some of those questions. I think there's generally a consensus that B2B marketing is different than taking my data and targeting me with an ad or selling my email address. If I want to buy a list of CEOs of major banks and send them a letter, hire me, or I want to sell you furniture, that is properly exempted from most of the proposed federal and state laws, with the caveat that the exception that California intended to build in has expired, and that's frankly one reason that could and should be rectified by a federal law. With regard to whether health should be in one bill or a second bill, I'll leave that to the legislative strategists. But I think that the point that is being raised by that question is, right now, if it's HIPAA, we know it's covered by one set of committees and one set of legislation, and then everything else suddenly is part of this big general bill. And obviously, there is some data that isn't covered by HIPAA because it's not collected through the medical system or through health insurance, but could be very akin to that. I download my medical record. I take a COVID test at home versus my doctor gives me a COVID test, right? Clearly, we recognize that's kind of the same thing. There's less clarity over, I read something on a website about, the latest news about COVID, or I have a pedometer, which might reveal how often I jog, which is interesting, but is that also medical because it can be? And so I think there's a desire and there's a need to ensure that the most sensitive health data is properly recognized, and we don't have that clarity today. It's one of the problems in a lot of state laws. Health can be the most sensitive, and it can sometimes be, my shopping activity, which could be revealing, but probably ought to be treated differently. So agreed that legislation should give us more nuance, whether it's in one bill or whether it's split into two bills. I'll leave to sort of the legislative pieces. Should we import GDPR? I guess for years I would have said, no, let's show kind of the American way to do it. But now that we've tried to do the American way and kind of made a bit of a jumble in many of our proposals, I have new appreciation for the thought that went into GDPR. When COVID hit, we were instantly said, oh, how are the Europeans going to deal with that? Privacy law is not going to let them do anything. Well, guess what? There's a pandemic exception. There's a Christmas and Santa Claus exception. There's a lot of nuance. So it might not be terrible to take a look at the things the Europeans got right, but also look at some of the areas where the courts or where data protection authorities have narrowed things far more restrictive than I think those of us who might want to see data used for research. Health research clearly shouldn't be done country by country. We want to know whether a vaccine affects people of different countries, different vaccines, and it can be enormously hard to do health research across border in Europe, let alone cross Atlantic. I'll just say a quick thing about the civil rights piece. Critical that those issues are core. I think there's a lot of consensus there. There is a lot the administration could do today with the agencies that are historically the expert on those areas, but there are areas that go beyond. I spent some time with the CEO of, ChatGPT last night, and, my hair was on edge when I was like, oh my God, look at the challenges and the harms and the risks. We need legislation that really ensures that every, Tom, Joe, and Sally who just plays with sort of that tool doesn't, create incredibly dangerous and risky things. And so having safeguards in consumer protection law that would put guardrails around that would actually, I think, support innovation. I'm sensitive to the precautionary concept, but I think we're at a point where there's so much frothiness and so much inconsistent regulation and so much confusion that thoughtful regulation is the best thing that most industry and most optimists about the use of data can and should want.
I think if you define thoughtful as more than I thought about this, to actually, the Europeans thought about this and thought about this and thought about it. And I agree, Jules, there's important and useful components of GDPR, but you look at a lot of it and it's pretty problematic. As you noted, limiting research data for research. There's a new study by several academics in the EU that found that this really, really hurts small web publishers, almost to the point where it's harder to do a web startup or an internet startup now because you can't monetize the same way. So I don't think this is frankly all that hard in the sense of we all know what the right privacy bill is that get somebody used the Goldilocks analogy where not too soft, not too hard. We all know what that is. And it's really just a question of the two things that I think maybe Adam or Linda said, preemption and private right of action. And those are political questions we got to resolve. Steve, I want to go over to you because I know you've been doing a lot of thinking also about privacy and some of the potential pitfalls that we might see.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. All of the folks on this call understand it, but it's the audience that would benefit from understanding the example of why any privacy legislation at the federal level must preempt the state laws, especially those that create a private right of action. Linda talked about the private right of action and the costs. Gary mentioned trial lawyers, and I love the idea of exporting them. But Rob, you and Daniel Castro have done a lot of work on the privacy panic, the notion of generating through panicked rhetoric the demand for legislation. But this Illinois law that I described earlier, the biometric information law, is about a privacy payday, a payday for the trial bar. And it's a true and ongoing story. It started in Illinois in 2008. The biometric law was intended to address a fingerprint data collector who used the information in ways that were unauthorized. And it entitles anyone whose data is ever collected without a written release to recover $5,000 per incident without any showing that they suffered any harm or there was any intent to harm. That's what we mean by a private right of action with a statutory damage, an amount that's buried in the statute without you having to say I was harmed. This has been a boon to predatory trial lawyers in Illinois and a real pain for Illinois consumers. The Chicago law firm brought class action lawsuits on behalf of unnamed and unknown Illinois residents, claiming that they may have used facial recognition on their photo albums, their own photo albums, to identify their own friends and family. So the facial recognition that you use when you say, show me all photos with this face in it, they claimed that that was a violation, and each violation was $5,000 because the family member that you tagged, Rob, didn't have express consent obtained beforehand. So Edelson won almost $2 billion suing Shutterfly, Apple Photos, Amazon Photos, Facebook, and Google. And today those services will not allow Illinois users to tag faces in photos. And then finally, let me advance past this. When Amazon and Nest developed doorbells with cameras that could do facial recognition, people everywhere used them to recognize the faces of family, daycare, housekeepers, scheduled visitors in order to automate the door opening. It also informs the homeowner and even to open an electronic latch. But that feature, not available in Illinois. Too much liability to offer that at all. I think this demonstrates the necessity of recognizing that the American tort system is broken. We're the only country left where we don't have the English rule, which says that the loser pays. So people bringing frivolous lawsuits would have to pay if they don't win the lawsuit. They'd have to pay the costs of the other side. In our situation, it's completely different. Defamation lawsuits like the ones I'm describing in Illinois, are the scourge of business community in America, and we need to finish that tort reform. And a privacy law that preempts state laws like Illinois is a great first step.
Steve, could I sue my daughter because she's identified me in some of her posts, and I find that a violation of my privacy. So I could get I could cancel her allowance for the next 2 years. But I might have to live in Illinois to do that. So that's the problem. Dang. Unless there's other comments on any of this so far, I want to move over to another question. 230. I can't have a conversation about this without talking about Section 230, which is essentially a shield for online for companies that moderate online content. I think it was. I can't remember who was saying this, Adam. It might have been you or Linda. I can't remember. I'm sorry. But basically, this is one of those things that in one way is unsolvable because one side wants no liability. The other side wants enormous liability. We want to be able to sue you for anything that you say. Another side says we want to sue you for taking down anything you take down. I don't see any way to square that circle. ITIF, Ashley Johnson on our team has written a number of really good analysis of 230 with some reforms. So I think there's a way, as Bill Clinton once famously said, we want to mend it, not end it, when he was referring to welfare. I'm just curious thoughts from anybody on the panel about where you think we should go with 230 reform, if at all. Adam?
Yeah, I don't want to mend it. I want to just keep it as is because I think it's a great law. I think it's one of the best laws that we've had. And I think it's become basically a political football for both parties to hold hostage in exchange for what they want is more favorable treatment from platforms for their preferences, their speech preferences. Democrats typically say, the bills the Democrats have introduced carve out protection from Section 230 for types of speech that they're concerned about: vaccine, information, election denial, et cetera. The fact is, Section 230 provides incentives for content moderation today. So all of the objectives that Democrats have, I believe, with respect to wanting platforms to moderate content are actually encouraged by Section 230, right? It encourages that kind of content moderation. On the flip side, I think you're already seeing the House Republicans focusing on this kind of job-owning platforms, and this question of did the Biden administration have too much influence, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, they're going to hold Section 230 hostage in exchange for kind of more favorable content policies as well. The fact is, again, if 230 went away, I think platforms would have a choice between being Disneyland, a very sanitized environment, or a wasteland to moderate nothing. And if you choose Disneyland, then a lot of conservative content's going to get pushed off platforms altogether, which I think is not really well understood by conservatives. And if you have a wasteland, consumers are just going to give up on social media. There's a reason why 4chan is not that popular. So I just think that we have a war between the parties over political speech online, and Section 230 gets kind of held as the hostage. I don't really think it's genuine attempts to reform 230.
Adam, just on that point, I think it's a really critical point you make. We've had a monthly column or series called Defending Digital that my colleague David Moshello has written. And the last one, it's either up or will be up, was basically to say, look, we have deep political divisions and cultural divisions in this country, and people blame it on tech. It's actually wrong when you really look at the evidence. Those divisions are there. Tech is not the cause of the division. And so we need to sort of get causality right here. There are deeper problems. And to your point, the problems between Republicans and Democrats are on these cultural questions are very, very serious. And is there a way to resolve them? I don't know. But 230 is not the way to do that. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, so it's so important for audiences to understand where 230 came from, because there's mythology associated with why we have 230. But for anyone who's seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, that's a true story. And more importantly, it's the origin story of Section 230. So Jordan Belfort was running a boiler room operation in New York and ripping off investors, just like the movie laid out. True story. And there were a handful of investors who took to Prodigy, a bulletin board service at the time, and went on the investment bulletin board and told all of their peers who used the service to stay away from Jordan Belfort's firm, Stratton Oakmont, because they'll rip you off. So what did the Wolf of Wall Street do? He sued Prodigy. He sued Prodigy for defamation over the comments that are made about his firm, Stratton Oakmont. That's probably not surprising given the character that Leonardo DiCaprio played. But what is surprising is that a judge in New York said that Prodigy, well, you are liable for the defamatory comments of your users because, Prodigy, you've decided to do some content moderation to eliminate certain forms of, let's say, profanity, hate speech, or nudity on your platform. So if you do any content moderation, I guess you're responsible for all the content that shows up. So it was Chris Cox, who was in Congress at the time, worked with Ron Wyden, and they wrote Section 230 to respond to that court ruling and the Wolf of Wall Street. And they said that if Prodigy does some moderation, it is never responsible for a defamation lawsuit over things that you and I say on the platform. It goes on to say that if Prodigy does some effort to regulate what it considers to be offensive speech, that it's also not liable for taking down what it thinks is offensive. So 230 was not some giveaway to the tech industry. It was to constrain the trial bar and to constrain plaintiffs who would actually sue social media into oblivion starting 26 years ago.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that if I can, because Section 230 I was there also when it was created, and it really was to say there's this great thing, the internet, and we have to make sure that it could grow, and it could grow in the United States in a very healthy way. And that's allowed a lot of the companies, which are now in a lot of people's 401k plans and elsewhere, and they haven't done great lately, but they've had many, many years of economic growth, hiring people, good jobs, providing a service for free, many of them, or a platform or something like that. And that's 230 has been really important. And what's happened the last several years is the local broadcasters, the National Association of Broadcasters, rallying against tech, pushing to eliminate 230 protections because it's a competitive thing with them. They, think about these local broadcasters. And I read the Wall Street Journal column by our president, And I think he's talking about the broadcasters. I'm concerned about how they've deepened extremism and polarization in our country. They've even put our children at risk. I mean, you watch the local news. If it bleeds, it leads. But they have lost their ability to advertise in an efficient way because other platforms have come and said, we've identified people. It goes to privacy, but it also goes to 230. So they're attacking 230 and trying to get it eliminated. So they basically will reduce the competition and in targeted advertising, create a whole bunch of liabilities for healthy tech companies that people want. But there are things that can be done. There are things which are steps, because I've been on the other side of it as well. I've been frustrated. I've been taken down by Nextdoor for talking about the fact that vaccines, I mean, once you have COVID, you have a certain level of protection, and maybe you shouldn't be first in line to get that vaccine when it was coming out. And I couldn't believe that this was happening. And now these Twitter files, they are really serious. And I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican. This is something we have to learn about when the government is using basically their power to try to shut down what the platforms are doing. That is the danger here, folks. It doesn't matter who you are. We believe in the First Amendment. That's a shared value we have. The First Amendment is not only in the Constitution, it's a principle of freedom of expression. 230 has encouraged freedom of expression. It's allowed the neighborhood square to exist and people to express different views. I don't love them. I don't love the fact that platforms can take down things that seemingly arbitrarily. And I think the answer to that, though, is sunshine. I think there's an obligation that if you're a platform, to say what you do and why you do it. And it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult for Facebook. It's difficult for Google. It's difficult for others. They have to do it in different countries with different cultural values. It's like trying to be the State Department and the UN and trying to be effective and have everyone criticizing you. So these are challenges, but I think they should be discussed. I think there should be hearings held. I think people should be invited on both sides. They should debate. And we should come up with a way of resolving the situation which exists today, whereas we want to protect our kids. We want to protect, though, a diversity of viewpoints. And maybe we don't, maybe it's, there are areas of discussion where there should be debate, like should everyone have to, is anonymity important in part of the First Amendment debate? Because some of these things that are being expressed are dangerous, and are kids getting shot up in schools, things like that. There's a lot of problems which are coming out. And there's socially unacceptable things, because we do draw lines. We draw lines around children. We want to protect them. We've never allowed, child sexual acts and things like that. That's the first thing where the First Amendment doesn't really cover. And we have to find those things, but not everyone to have one broad brush and say, get rid of 230. It's bad, because 230 protects the smaller interests. The bigger companies, they can deal with it, frankly. The smaller companies, we always have to look out for the smallest company. And every time Congress does something, or the FTC comes up with a new rule, in a way, the big companies can manage it. It'll hurt them. It'll hurt their shareholders. It'll hurt jobs and hurt our national competitiveness. But the small companies are the one we're blocking out with every time there's a new rule and put into place.
Yeah, and I would just say that, Congress should apply that rule, that thought process to all of these: privacy, antitrust, 230. After GDPR was put into effect in Europe, the largest companies gained market share, because the smaller and medium-sized companies just couldn't adapt to the new privacy regime and all the hurdles that it put in place. And so that's the opposite of what most policymakers want. That's the effect they're trying to actually legislate against, is the market share of the larger companies. But some of these pieces of legislation they're considering would have the opposite effect. It would give higher market share, greater market share to the largest companies, and freeze out any new entrants that are worried about the compliance regime, all the costs associated with it, and frivolous lawsuits that would literally drive them out of business. So I just think that policymakers really need to apply that screen to everything that they're doing.
Great. Jason.
Yeah, Rob, you mentioned in your opening remarks the encyclopedia and how much better it is to find information online. I think it's also important to remember that part of the magic of Section 230 and the importance of Section 230 is it allows the indexing of information online without liability. I mean, that is the focus of our brief to the Supreme Court in the Google case. A reminder that Section 230 is what protects organizations that index information, that make it available online in ways that would be insurmountable in the absence of that liability protection. Information certainly could not be indexed in the way that it is. Algorithms could not be used in the way that they are online to make information easily accessible. We would go back to the thumbing through the index in the encyclopedia days in the absence of Section 230. So the content moderation issues that Adam and Steve have talked so eloquently about are obviously hugely important, but Section 230 protects much more than that, and is much more to the internet and the success of of the internet, and has been since enacted in 1996. And these are important issues for us to keep in mind to respond to the calls to change it.
Yeah, Jason, that's an important point because I think everybody thinks of 230 in a very narrow sense of pure sort of moderation of other content. I remember when I worked years ago at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, and we were tasked by congressional committees to write reports, and we would want to find something, some article or whatever. We'd have to go down to the library, fill out a form in paper, hand it to the librarian, and then maybe 3 or 4 days later, we would get the article. So now it's obviously at your fingertip. Maybe just to wrap up, one note, Gary, you made I thought was an important point about protecting children. And I'm going to lay out a controversial idea. If you're all familiar with the Overton window, it's a sort of think tank concept that one of the jobs of think tanks is to widen the window of what's possible in terms of policy. And here's one I think we need to widen, and that's digital identification. The country of Estonia has almost 100% digital IDs. It's not used for government surveillance. One of the great things about digital IDs is that they can allow you to represent certain elements of yourself. So I could go to a library and prove that I'm over 18 years old, or that I go to the Montgomery County Library and I can prove that I'm a resident of Montgomery County. And it's actually more privacy protected because I just took a book out of the Montgomery County Library. I'm sure one you've all read, The History of Intellectual Property in the U.S. You read that one? It's a great book. But anyway, it's out now, so you can't get it. You know, I don't care whether the librarian knows that, but at the end of the day, it would have been so much nicer to just use a digital ID and it just said somebody in Montgomery County has this book. But anyway, my point there, and maybe Steve, you can respond to this too, because I know you've been doing thinking there. If we had digital IDs, that is a way to have age verification that actually works. And it's a way to keep kids out of the places they should not be allowed to go. But it then opens up for freedom for adults to be able to do that. So just thoughts on that?
Rob, I would suggest that's an innovation. It's well worth exploring. We, though, in this country are a little different than Estonia. We have this real strong cultural aversion to government-issued, government-maintained identification. And
can I hold up my driver's license to you? But I guess that's
seriously. I mean, and think about what happened when real ID mandates came out for driver's license and how difficult it's been to get that through. But we're moving in the right direction to realize that anonymity, while it's essential for free expression and divisive speech to avoid being cracked down by the government, being doxxed by your opponents, anonymity is also a tool that's used by criminals. And it's a tool that maybe makes the internet a lot less safe than it otherwise could be. I'd love to see experimentation with this, but I don't think America is the kind of a place where Congress is going to dictate that. The experimentation is probably going to come from think tanks that expand the Overton window and come up with proposals that companies can invest in.
I would agree with that. I think what's going on and what you're suggesting that it'd be a mandate gets me nervous.
Gary, by the way, just to be clear, I do not want a mandate. All we've proposed is simply saying my wife had to renew her passport. All we wanted was when you renew your passport, you can pay $20. And if you want to do that, you could get a digital ID. So I totally agree on mandates.
And if companies want to do that, and people want to do that, the market will indicate that. But a lot of things could happen voluntarily, as you indicate. And that's how we have at CTA. We created a privacy standard with all the relevant companies focusing on the devices that they wear. And this was under the Obama administration. And it's been very successful. It's a voluntary standard affecting privacy. But I do want to point out something. Some of us were around for the SOPA PIPA revolt by consumers. And we haven't talked about what Americans actually want. And you know, definitely Adam presented research. Net Choice Chamber of Commerce had research. CTA did research. And we found that only 3% of Americans think antitrust is something that Congress should be messing with and regulating technology with. It's not a top issue at all. And more, and this is significant for our audience, 57% of the Americans we surveyed said that if there's tech legislation affecting their devices, it will make them less likely to vote for their member of Congress who supported it. And the reason I brought up SOPA PIPA, because basically Americans revolted in 1 week, and something which had gone unanimously through the Senate Judiciary Committee was turned out and became dead. So the SOPA PIPA is like naming your kid Adolf. We don't talk about it anymore because it was such a bad idea because companies said this is going to affect your use of the internet. And I think if you start messing with the platform, take, Apple lovers are Apple lovers. They love everything that platform offers and everything it does. And people love Google search engines. You want to start breaking up those companies. You want to start doing things to this. The average consumer is going to all of a sudden pay attention to who their politician is. And that's not a threat. That's just a reality. This is what's going to happen if some of the proposals out there pass, or they see what happens to their stock portfolios, which a lot of people aren't happy about. So I think we're in a situation where we've done it right to this point, as a famous author 200 years ago said, eventually we get it right as Americans because we talk about and think about everything else. But I think we have to do it right with innovation because that is our secret sauce. It's made our country great, and it's allowed us the liberties as Americans that we all enjoy, appreciate, and agree upon. They're embedded in our Constitution and our culture. And that's what we should be talking about, is what is best for the future. That's what's best to protect local broadcasters. They fought against cable.
Barry, I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
They fought against a lot of things. Sorry, I'll end right now.
Okay, thank you. That was a great summary. Sorry, but I want to give, we're really at time, but I want to give everybody, and I'll do them in the order I see, 30-second wrap up if you'd like, sort of where are we, what should we do, how are things going? Jules.
These issues are complex. There are trade-offs that we need to deal with for every problem we want to solve. I do think it's a time for regulation. We got to figure out how to get past sort of the firing squad of I'm doing this to win a point, I'm doing this to critique this actor or not. There are real human rights in the balance. We need data to solve society's problems, but we need people and organizations to be able to trust that the data is being used for their benefit. Thoughtful, smart regulation. I'm optimistic because I think Congress, with help from the administration and think tanks and other experts, are capable of it. Lock us all in a room and let's get it done.
Thank you. Great. Steve.
Yeah, NetChoice mission is to help make the internet safe for free enterprise and free expression. And that's become ridiculously difficult in a hyper-partisan atmosphere where rhetoric and sound bites are what drive the vote for legislation. And when legislation passes that's bad, I'm afraid that all of the companies and trade associations have to come together and take it to the court. And all of you have been super allies at lawsuits to stop Florida and Texas, to stop the California law. We're going to have to rely upon our Constitution and the courts to put a brake on what states will do as purely political moves to overregulate technology and the internet.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Linda.
Let's pass a national privacy law. Last year, TechNet created the United for Privacy Coalition. You can find us online. We brought lots of industries together who want a privacy law. We thought we wouldn't even get a hearing, but we got a bill out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. We have real progress already to point to. Let's build upon that and get a privacy law. And then let's also fulfill the promise of the CHIPS and Science Act. Let's make sure that we fund the tech hubs, that we create those tech hubs to really get into the emerging technologies that will define the future, beat China on all those emerging technologies, and make sure we have the skilled talent that we need to make those fabs work, and also the clean energy and AVs.
Thank you, Linda. That's great. Jason.
Yeah, I think it's clear from our discussion today that the tech industry is focused on policies that promote innovation and benefit U.S. competitiveness. And we can do that by working with like-minded partners around the world to ensure secure supply chains, to ensure that we have policies that promote investment in infrastructure and investment in innovation. I think the Biden administration, to circle back to the president's op-ed, should be focused on areas where they can work with Congress in the 118th in a bipartisan fashion to promote innovation. And I think those policies can do things like get us back on track with trade. We need to enter into trade agreements. We need to facilitate commerce with our like-minded allies around the world. And that's where we should be focused. We should be focused on creating opportunities for U.S. companies around the world and working to make America more competitive by bringing the best and the brightest from around the world to the U.S. to start the next great American technology companies.
Great. Thank you. Adam, you have last at bat. Adam, you're on mute. Can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. All right, Adam, you're not last at bat. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, anybody else not hear Adam? Couldn't. Okay.
Yeah, I can't hear him.
All right. Adam, sorry about that. Enjoyed your comments earlier, so we'll wrap up. Hey, I want to thank everybody on the panel. This was really, really great. And I want to thank the folks who are listening. And this video will also be posted if you want to share it with anybody later with your friends or colleagues. So again, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you for a great panel.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Rob.
you,
Thanks,
ITIF.
everybody.